My name is Lena Whitaker. I'm 29 years old. And for nearly 4 years, I believed something that kept me awake most nights. I believed my grandmother died poor. That's what my parents told me. They said the hospital bills had eaten everything. The house was sold to cover debt. The farm equipment went to auction. There was nothing left but a few photographs and the smell of lavender that used to cling to her sweaters. I believed them. And because I believed them, I never asked questions. By the time I was 28, I was working 2 part-time jobs in Dayton, Ohio. I waited tables during the day and stocked shelves at a pharmacy 3 nights a week. My apartment was a 1-room studio above a laundromat that rattled every time the spin cycle started downstairs. It wasn't the life my grandmother imagined for me, but it was the life I thought I deserved. Then one Thursday afternoon, a man in a gray suit knocked on the door of the diner where I worked and said 7 words that made my entire childhood suddenly feel like a lie. "Are you Lena Whitaker, Margaret's granddaughter?" Before I tell you what happened next, let me take you back a little. Because the truth about that moment started long before the knock on the diner door. It started in a town called Ashford, population just under 5,000. 1 main street, 2 traffic lights, and a water tower painted with a faded bluebird. My parents were the kind of people everyone trusted. My dad, Thomas Whitaker, worked as a mechanic at the county garage. My mom, Elaine, ran the charity bake sales every spring. To the outside world, they were steady, respectable people. Inside our house, things were quieter, more controlled. My parents believed in rules, a lot of them. I had a curfew until I was 21. I wasn't allowed to drive out of town without telling them where I was going and when I'd be back. When I got my first job at 16, my mother insisted the paychecks go into a family account so they could help me manage money. At the time, it sounded responsible. I didn't realize until much later that I had never actually seen the balance. The one person who treated me differently was my grandmother. Margaret Whitaker lived 20 minutes outside town on a small farm surrounded by maple trees. She grew tomatoes the size of softballs and kept chickens that wandered wherever they pleased. When I visited, she never asked where I was going or what time I'd be back. She'd just hand me a glass of iced tea and say something like, "Go walk the fields for a while. A girl needs room to think." When I graduated high school, she tried to convince my parents to let me go to college in Columbus. "You can't keep her here forever," she told my father one evening at the kitchen table. He didn't yell. He never yelled. He just folded his newspaper and said, "College fills people's heads with ideas that don't help them live." So I stayed. I worked at the grocery store, then the diner. I helped my mom with the garden. I lived in the same bedroom I'd had since middle school. And every few weeks, I drove out to see my grandmother. The last real conversation we had happened about 8 months before she died. We were sitting on her porch watching a thunderstorm roll over the fields. She had a blanket wrapped around her shoulders even though it was July. She looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "Lena," she said quietly, "if anything ever feels wrong in that house, promise me you'll trust your instincts." I laughed a little. "Grandma, what does that mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she said something else. "I've made arrangements, just in case." At the time, I thought she meant funeral plans. 3 months later, she died of heart failure. The funeral was small. My father handled most of the paperwork. The farm sold quickly to a developer who planned to build vacation cabins. A week after the funeral, my parents sat me down at the kitchen table. My father cleared his throat. "Your grandmother left a lot of debt," he said. "Medical bills, property taxes. Everything had to be sold to settle it." My mom nodded sadly. "There's no inheritance, honey." I remember feeling disappointed for about 10 seconds. Then I felt guilty for even thinking about money. So I said the only thing that seemed right. "That's okay." And that was the end of it. Or at least I thought it was. 2 years later, I finally moved out of my parents' house. There wasn't a fight, just a slow realization that if I didn't leave, I might never start my own life. I moved to Dayton with 1 suitcase and $600. My parents didn't visit. They called occasionally, mostly to ask if I was managing. City life can be hard, my father liked to remind me. For a while, things were fine. Then the rent went up, then my car broke down, Then the diner cut everyone's hours during the winter. That's how I ended up working 2 jobs and living above a laundromat. I told myself it was temporary. I just needed a break. The break came on a Thursday afternoon. The lunch rush at the diner had just ended when the door opened and a man stepped inside. He was maybe 60, wearing a gray suit that looked expensive enough to make everyone else in the room notice. He walked straight to the counter. "Excuse me," he said politely. "Is Lena Whitaker working today?" My stomach tightened. "That's me." He studied my face carefully. "Are you Margaret Whitaker's granddaughter?" Something about the way he said my grandmother's name made my chest feel strange. "Yes," I said slowly. He took a small envelope out of his briefcase. "My name is Richard Bell, attorney at law. I've been trying to locate you for several months." I blinked. "I'm sorry, locate me for what?" He slid the envelope across the counter. "For your inheritance." For a moment the entire diner felt silent. "My parents told me there wasn't one," I said. Richard Bell's expression changed in a way that lawyers probably try very hard to hide. Confusion. "Miss Whitaker," he said carefully, "your grandmother established a trust fund worth approximately $420,000. I stared at him. "I think there's been a mistake." "There hasn't." My hands were shaking when I opened the envelope. Inside was a photocopy of a legal document with my name printed clearly at the top. Primary beneficiary, Lena Marie Whitaker. My grandmother's signature sat at the bottom. The room started to feel too small. "My parents said everything was gone," I whispered. Richard Bell sighed softly. "They informed my office that you had moved overseas and could not be reached." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "That's not true." "I suspected as much." He leaned forward slightly. "Your grandmother was very specific about her wishes. The trust was created 2 years before she passed away." "Did my parents know about it?" "Yes," he said quietly. "They were present when the documents were signed." The diner clock ticked loudly on the wall. For the first time in my life, a thought about my parents appeared that I had never allowed myself to consider before. What if they had lied? The next week was a blur of paperwork. I visited Richard Bell's office, verified my identity, and signed the documents necessary to access the trust. The number on the account statement made my head spin. $421,386.72, more money than I had ever imagined having. But the money wasn't the thing that kept me awake at night. It was the question that refused to leave. Why? Why would my parents hide this from me? The answer came sooner than I expected. When the bank transferred the first portion of the funds into my account, my phone rang that evening. It was my father. His voice was calm. Too calm. "I heard you've been talking to a lawyer." My heart started pounding. "Yes." A long pause. Then he said something that told me everything I needed to know. "You should have left that alone." I looked around my tiny apartment above the laundromat, the cracked ceiling, the humming machines downstairs, the life I had been struggling to build on my own. "You told me Grandma died with nothing," I said. Another pause. "We were protecting you." From what? From money you weren't ready to handle. I almost laughed. "I've been working 2 jobs for 3 years. That was your choice." "No," I said quietly. "It was the only choice I had." Silence filled the phone line. Then my father said one last thing. "If you keep pushing this, you'll regret it." The call ended. I sat on my couch, staring at the wall for a long time. Then I did something my grandmother would have been proud of. I called Richard Bell the next morning. "Can we review the trust documents again?" I asked. "Of course." "And one more thing," I said slowly. "I think my parents might have tried to keep me from finding out about it." There was a pause. Then the lawyer spoke carefully. "If that's the case, Miss Whitaker, you may have legal options." For the first time since the man in the gray suit walked into the diner, I felt something new. Not anger, not fear. Clarity. My grandmother had spent her life growing things in quiet fields outside Ashford. And somehow, before she died, she had planted one final seed. A way for me to build a life she always believed I deserved. This time, no one was going to take it away.